Hi everyone, this is Sean Ismail from the Cloud Ranger, and you are viewing the Microsoft Azure training. In today's session, we are going to talk about Azure Virtual Networks, and this is the part 2 of this session. In the part 1 of this session, what we talked about was creating Azure Virtual Networks, or VNets. We had created some VNets, we had put in some subnets there, we talked about address spaces, we talked about isolation, and accessing services across VNet subnets. In this session, we are going to start talking about things like the Azure VNet configuration files, importing those files, exporting those files, and how to do that from PowerShell. And we are also going to talk about a little bit of a big picture of Azure Virtual Networks. So let's get started. So in the previous session, the part 1, we talked about creating the virtual network, and we briefly went through a demonstration of how everything was written to a network configuration file when a VNet was created. So we're not going to spend too much time on slides today, and we are going to jump right in and show how this network configuration file can be exported to an XML file and also imported. We are going to modify a network config file and see how the changes take effect. And then we'll use some PowerShell commandlets to do that. So let's jump to our Azure, our client PC to access the Azure management portal. Okay, as you can see, I'm already logged into my account. And at this time, you should go ahead and log in your account. And I already have the PowerShell console opened up here. I just want to make sure I'm connected to the right subscription. Okay, I'm running on the free trial. So what we are going to do first today is go and create a very simple VNet and then look into the configuration file that it creates. So the way we do that, and I did not want to do this offline, like I mentioned in most of my sessions, is that I try to do as much possible online with you, so that way you can follow along and get your bearings. So create a virtual network. I'm going to call it Ranger VNet 1. You can obviously name whatever you want and choose your location. As you know, every virtual network should be associated with a location or a region. For me, it's East US 2. I'm going to leave this DNS server and all these configurations blank here and go ahead. The address space, that's going to be 192.168.0.0. It's going to be 16. I'm going to name my subnet web. You can name anything here really. 1.0. And if you have jumped into this video directly from YouTube or my blog site, and you do not have too much idea of what's going on here, you can obviously go and watch the part 1 of this session, and you can learn that there, where we go in a little bit more details on what we are doing here. So I'm just creating a very small subnet here with a address space 192.168, and I've created a subnet here, subnet web, and that's the range. Click OK. This doesn't take too long to create. Create the notification over here. I just want to make sure that it has been created. Also, meanwhile, while this is going on, I go in all items, and as you can see that there is nothing else here except the virtual network that's being created. I've noticed that the notification area usually says that it has been created, but the status still has the creating going on. Usually Azure portal is quite good at this. For all purposes, it's already up and running, but there are certain things that's being still configured on the back end. But as you can see, getting into there and under the configuration, we can see the address space and everything we just created. So it's almost the same thing brought in the configure tab here to show you. Okay, so the virtual network has been created and we get two options here. Well, on the management portal, to look at the network configuration file, there's no way you can see the network configuration file here. And the reason behind that is because you have all the configurations under the configure tab and you can see the configurations here. But to actually see that config file that was created for this VNet, you have the option to export it from here. So you select your virtual network and click on export. You need to pick your subscription, and that's all you have to do here, and it will download a network config.xml file. So let's go ahead and we are going to put this on the desktop just so it's easy to access. Show you just an XML file, and by default my one is opening with the Internet Explorer. So this is the network config file .xml. You can obviously open it with Notepad or any other editor you prefer. So we looked at this in our last session, and we're going to go into a little bit more details on what we see here. As you can see that there are various elements to this XML file, but the ones we are interested in are the ones we have already filled in. You can see that virtual network site location, this is what we had. This was the name of our virtual network, our address prefix, and also the subnet name and the address prefix. So I'll go through these elements in a little bit details a bit later, but I just wanted to show you how this can be exported. The other way to export this XML file is obviously through PowerShell, and the way we would do that is get Azure VNet config, and we're going to export to file because we are obviously going to do that. I'm going to just put it in my temp. Let's give it a name, network config. You can obviously name anything that makes more sense to you. And that's all there is to it. So this function is similar to coming over to your portal here and clicking on this export. And if you did not want to export this, so just having this commandlet will show you the XML file, and I'm going to just do this. It'll show you the entire XML file as well if you just wanted to quick view it. So if we go to our temp right now, we can see the network config XML file. It's the same file that is downloaded over here. So let's go back to our slide a little bit and talk about this XML file. So this is like a brief excerpt from the network configuration file. It's similar to the one we just had right now. There are various elements over here, obviously. You can see the virtual network site. We have the site name, the location, the address prefix, where we created the prefix of our network, the address space, and the address prefix here is for the subnet. So these are not all the elements that you have seen here. Like for example, we did not go and put the values for the DNS, but here it is. But if you had put that, it would have been here. If you go to MSDN, you can actually see the schema of this XML file, and you can see all the various elements that are possible to be in this network configuration file. So for example, if you create multiple VNets, if you created a gateway for them, if you had site-to-site information for VPN, everything related to network configuration would be in this XML file. The reason this is very important, both for your certification exam as well as your day-to-day task, is that this file can be authored or this file can be modified to your needs for your network configuration. So there are times we will go to the portal and we will create virtual network right from the portal. And that's what we will initially do. But if you have to do a mass modification or even a script creating a virtual network uh, for creating them, deleting them, or modifying them, XML file, this network configuration file, is actually the only place you can do that. So technically, there is no commandlet for you to go and just go create a virtual network from PowerShell. What you have to do is actually take a configuration file and modify that or author that from scratch and have PowerShell import that to your subscription to create the network. And we will go through one of that actually. So this is initially something we'll just work with. This is not very complicated. It's just an address space with a subnet, and it's easier to understand rather than a large configuration file. I've seen configuration file which spanned like a couple of pages just because things were so complicated, and it was I mean not complicated necessarily, but it was just that the network was so large and it can get complicated. So let's let's look at the two commandlets. The first one we actually looked at was the export to file. And the next one now I'm going to show you is the importing of that file. And the reasons we are going to import this as well. This is something we are going to go through a demonstration right now. Okay, so we are back to our client PC here. And I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to go here and delete that entire network we just created. Let's wait for it to delete. Okay, so the deletion is completed, and under networks you see that we have no virtual networks. I create one to get started. So what we are doing right now is we're going to come back here, and there are two ways now we can get our network back from the XML file that we had downloaded. So as some of you might have realized by now that this is probably a very good way to back up your virtual networks on Azure, is like download that XML file. So even if somehow uh, by mistake, if you had deleted the network, that will be the only way to get back. So one way to do that is going to go, we have to go to new, and you can see under network services, virtual network, you can import a configuration file. So we can browse the file and go and pick the network configuration file that we had downloaded. So if I go to desktop, this PC, and go to C drive and go to temp here, we can pick up the one that we had exported to C temp earlier. That'd be one way to do it. And you just select that file and click on next, and the network would show up here. But the real demonstration that I'm going to go through is the one you can do from PowerShell. So this would be set 0 vnet config. You put the configuration path. So I'm going to take the same path where we had exported it with the name here. And that's all there is to it. So whatever works for you, if you want to do this from PowerShell, you can go ahead and do that, or you can do that from the management portal as well. But this would be the only way you can do this from PowerShell scripts. So if you had a script which would go and create, for example, a virtual network, go and deploy virtual machines to it, you'd actually create an XML file with all this information, and that would go and import it to your Azure subscription, and that's how the network will be formed. So if you come back here right now, you can see that it went and created the VNet for us, and it actually has all the configurations for us as well. Very good way to back it up, very good way to script it. And like I mentioned before, there's no commandlet here that actually goes and creates this whole thing for you. So if you had to go and script this, you'd have to do one from scratch. You take a network config.xml, open it up on your editor, create one, and do that. Which brings us to a next important thing, is that how can we edit this file and create something new? So let's look at this. We already have a VNet here, and we already have our subnet here and stuff here, the configuration. What we are going to do is we're going to take the same configuration file, export it, and open it in your whatever editor you prefer. And we can actually modify this file and add and delete stuff and make that reflect your subscriptions virtual networks. So let's go ahead with one modification so that way I can demonstrate this for you. So let's look at this element here, subnets. We know that we have one subnet called subnet web. So let's go ahead and create another subnet. So all we will do is copy this, and this is the only way I remember, and I make sure that I don't make any mistake. So for the subnet name, I'm going to call this subnet FTP, for example. I want to make sure that the prefix for this is 2.0. So you can add more elements to this XML file based on whatever design you want to, and that's what I'm saying. You could literally create one from scratch if you have to. So I'm going to save this, and the way you are going to modify this is that you are just going to re-import this file over the existing one. So this time I'm going to go and do one from here. You could have done this from PowerShell. I mean, we could have literally just run the set Azure VNet config and imported that, but I just wanted to demonstrate this one as well. So I'm going to do an import configuration, browse for file. Let's not take the desktop one because we know that we went and created this in my temp folder. So I'm going to select that and do an import. So let's click on next. What you can see over here that this import will result in following changes. It's actually telling you that it is going to go and update your Ranger VNet 1 network that you already have. So we'll say, okay, we do want this update. So it's a very interesting way to remember that what's going on when you import this file. So let's go ahead and import this configuration file. So you can see that it's importing the network configuration file right now. I'm looking into the details. It's applying the network configuration file. It's already imported it. So at this time in the back end, what's going on is that while it was importing, it knew that it had some updates to make, and it was applying that updates. So if everything worked out correctly, we can go in this, and we should see a new subnet created for us. Like we say, subnet FTP. This is the one that we had created, and yeah, we have one here. So obviously you can author or modify this XML file and create some more complicated networking from here. And this is the easiest to do it. Some people prefer the only way to do it is from here. I've seen people do that as well. So I'm going to go and provide another demo right now where I go and remove this and bring back to our original one. So just to show you that you can do both addition, deletion, modification, whatever you want. So let's come over here, and this is the set Azure. Okay, let's try this. It's doing the same thing we had done last time, but from the management portal. Okay, as we can see, it's the command like succeeded here. So if we go back to our portal, I want to go to my VNet, I want to go to my configuration, and I can see my subnet FTP was deleted. And that's what happened because we had gone and deleted that. So feel free to take this to your lab and create virtual networks, add and remove virtual networks and subnets and um, your address spaces. Check other options that we usually do from the management portal and see all the elements that show up here and uh, whatever you want to do from here. Obviously, this can be scripted, so feel free to script if some of you already have gone ahead. I mean, I know we did not talk too much about scripting, but we have gone through some commandlets, so you can go ahead and start scripting those as well. So let's go back to our slides. So that's all there was to it for our network configuration file in this session. So the next thing we are going to talk about in this session, and this will be the last thing and probably take most part of it, is we're going to look at the big picture. And this is the Azure Virtual Networks big picture. Some of you might wonder that why did we come to almost half of session 2 to provide the big picture rather than in the first part of this Azure Virtual Network session. I tried to hold this off as much as possible because I wanted to provide some basic underlying theory as well as demonstration before we get here to understand the overall picture of how things were working. So let's see what we have done so far. We went and created virtual network. We created virtual machines. And we put virtual machines in those virtual networks. And from our very first session or second session, you might have seen me RDP into those virtual machines, even when we did not do virtual networking. And what I basically told you is that Azure does everything in the back end for you. So as soon as you create a virtual machine, it's accessible to you from outside in the public network. All the IP addressing and everything were done for you. And in the last session, obviously, we tried to make things a little bit more precise, and we created a network and put virtual machines in that network. We saw how DHCP provided those private addresses, and we had a little bit more control over the internal IP addresses of the virtual machines. So now it's time for the big picture. Let's look at this. I'm going to talk about something called cloud service. You may have seen this cloud service when we were creating the virtual machines. Every time we create a virtual machine, there was a cloud service. We just went and checked that information, checked that box or just selected that box, drop down where it said that create a new cloud service for this. So what exactly is a cloud service? We are going to have an entire session on cloud services, but we need to understand cloud services because of how it ties into the overall networking. So what is a cloud service? For now, let's think that a cloud service is a container for all the virtual machines. So if you go and create a virtual machine called VM1, it will actually create a cloud service called VM1 as well. Or you can give a different name to this cloud service called web or FTP or whatever. But let's think that a cloud service will actually contain this VM1. So far, so good? It's quite easy, actually. What happens is that when we created a VM and we were trying to RDP in, this virtual machine was inside this cloud service. Azure went and gave this cloud service an IP address. So it was a public IP address, or Azure calls them for some reason a virtual IP or a VIP. And this VIP actually also had a DNS entry that Azure did for you. So anytime there's a cloud service that you create, it will actually have a cloudapp.net DNS entry from Azure. So when we were trying to RDP to VM1, we were actually RDPing to vm1.cloudapp.net. And it had that public IP address that was also associated with this cloud service. What we did in our last session was that we created a VM, and when it was part of the VNet we had created, it was getting an internal IP address, right, from the DHCP. This is basic virtualization and networking that we are used to in Hyper-V and VMware as well, that you create a virtual machine, it needs obviously an internal IP address. So Azure was giving us the DHCP feature to actually go pick up this internal IP address from our virtual network. And if you remember our last session, we showed in our demonstration that if you did not have a virtual network created, Azure would just give you one anyways. So what was happening in the bigger picture is that the cloud service was getting created, it was having a VIP, and there was a DIP or a internal IP address on the VM. The cloud service was translating the public IP address to the DIP. So when the user is trying to RDP or going to the website or whatever, it's going to vm1.cloudapp.net and it's getting translated to internal IP address. This is a basic network address translation that most of you networking folks will already know. But for now, for us, all we have to remember that every time you create a virtual machine, it has to be contained within a cloud service. So in the demonstration that's going to follow right now, I'm going to create a virtual machine and we will see that how it gives us an option at that time to create a new cloud service or use an existing cloud service. So you can actually go and create a cloud service before you even create a virtual machine. And when you create this virtual machine, you can put it in the cloud service. Or you can say that I don't want to put this into an existing cloud service because I don't have one. And you can do this during the VM creation. So let's go ahead and create one really quick. Okay, so we are back into our portal. I am going to go, and by now you all probably know what you have to do to create a virtual machine, which is create a virtual machine. I'm going to create one from the gallery because I want more control rather than a quick create. And we have gone through the steps before, right? So let's look at this. I am going to create a virtual machine called Ranger VM1. I'm going to select the size, put in all the information that you need to. Let's notice something over here. This virtual machine name can be anything you want. Okay, let's remember that. Next page, you can see the cloud service. We have always had the defaults here and only worked with the network and everything over here, but we really never really touched this part, and we could create it next. So this is where you would actually go and create a new cloud service. And obviously I do not have any cloud services created in my subscription, so it's not giving me the option to pick one from here. This cloud service DNS name over here, this usually when we created this VM, it's picking up the same name from here and transferring it over here. However, it does not have to be. You can have a totally different cloud app name over here. So for example, you could have gone and called this Ranger www or whatever. It does not have to be a virtual machine name. But this is something that you can choose for yourself, but you have to be careful that this is actually in the public domain. So the public IP address is going to have a DNS entry with this name. And as you know with DNS that it is a domain name. If it is taken, then obviously you cannot use it. So let's do something very common. So let's do something like Ranger. I'm assuming somebody already has taken that. So ranger.cloudapp.name, you can see that it's either a trademark or reserved word or somebody else has that. So if you have anything common if you have a common name that somebody may have already taken it, you won't be able to do it. So for me, Ranger VM1, which was same like my virtual machine name, Obviously, nobody has taken it, so I can see a little check mark here. It's very important that you actually take this as part of your planning when you're planning your virtual machine, that what's going to be your cloud service name. Now, obviously, if you're running a business, you are not going to have Ranger VM1 or just something.cloudapp.net. So even though Azure is going to create this DNS entry for you, you're probably going to go to your personal DNS for example, my web blog is cloudranger.net, and what we do is like we'll take that DNS of my domain and create a CNAME to this and use that. So you'll be doing all that. But for now, you just have to remember that this is how the cloud service will be created. So I'm going to go and put this put this VM in my virtual network that we created earlier, Ranger VNet 1. This is going to be the web. You can see it picked up the subnet, and I'm going to leave everything as it is. Now, let's look at the endpoints here. What we are saying in the endpoints here, and previously I went and perhaps just added something here or just modified this or left this alone. But what we are telling here is that this virtual machine that we are going to create is going to have two endpoints. So technically this is like a firewall. I'm saying that, hey, if I'm going to go remote desktop, pick a public port for whatever. But the private port we know for RDP is 3389. So whatever public port you create randomly, I don't care, but make sure it goes to 3389 because that's the only way my VM will accept for the RDP session. So by default, Azure gives you remote desktop and PowerShell. We'll create, for example, port 80, and you can see it will pick one up itself. That, hey, if somebody hits the port 80, then translate it to port 80 inside as well and let that traffic through. You can add whatever you want over here. So you can put test, and you can literally put whatever port numbers you want here for your application. That's something that can be done as well. But they have some predefined ones, the most common ones over here. So this works as a firewall. So when I say this works as a firewall, it means these are the endpoints your virtual machine will be listening on and allowing traffic through. So we are going to create a new cloud app, and let's see. Let's create this virtual machine. So I'm going to come back once this virtual machine is created. Okay, the virtual machine has been created. And I do pause these videos to just save the time it takes for these virtual machines to create. Some of these virtual machines, depending on the location you are, takes up to a couple of minutes to actually create. So it can be a little frustrating when you're doing this, but you need to have the patience to actually get this all up and running to actually see what's going on. Okay, so let's create OK on that. We are going to go into the virtual machine and the dashboard up here and see what has happened. So this is what we were talking about earlier, that it created a cloud service and put in a DNS entry for Ranger VM1.cloudapp.net. My host name or the VM name is Ranger VM1. This was the public IP or the public virtual IP, the VIP that we are talking about. So Azure assigns this public address to the cloud service and puts the DNS entry for you. And obviously our virtual network, if you remember, it was 192.168.1.4. I think that was the one we created. Yeah, this is the subnet, 192.168.1.0. So obviously Azure's internal DHCP server went ahead and helped us out to give it an internal IP address, and this is what is called the DIP. So if we go back to our slides real quick here, this is what we were talking about. This is the VIP address, which was the public IP address, and we had obviously a different name, cloudapp.net, and this was the DIP. So going back to our system here, I want to show you the endpoints that we had created. So the endpoints that were open, and you can see that we had auto over here. So Azure went and randomly selected a port for us. This is more of a security thing that it's randomizing your remote desktop so people don't go and publicly access or try to, run some sort of a brute force on your RDP session to get in. So obviously the port 80 was open, the private port was 80. So this is a port address translation where a port is translated to a different port. So for your network force, this is just the path that's running. And this VM already right now by default is publicly accessible. So you can see that this is the DNS name. So if we came over here and tried something like this, we probably will not get a reply. I'm doing this from my computer, obviously. vm1.cloudapp.net. What I'm trying to show you here is that it pings or it doesn't ping, that it's actually resolving to 192.127.156.14. This is the VIP. This is the one that we saw over here. Going to the dashboard. This is the one we saw over here, 156.14. It's a public IP address of the cloud service. So we are actually going from the internet and hitting this cloud service, and this is getting translated, and this would try to go to the VM. And the demonstration for this more clearly can be seen when we try to do something like actually going in RDPing to the virtual machine. So let's go click on this one and let's do connect. What this connect does, and we have been doing this to get in all our VMs so far, but this time I'm going to actually save this RDP. You'll see that's .rdp. Let's save it on the desktop, and I want to show you something over here. Let's click OK, go to the VM and endpoints. I want to show you this one, 53683 for the remote desktop. So if you go to this RDP and click on edit, you can actually see that it downloaded the file with the non-standard RDP port. So you might in your lab or in your work just go directly to your VM, but obviously you can see over here that it's using that random port that Azure had created for our VM. And right now, just putting in your username here, you should be able to connect. And you see it's actually connecting to that. So what it is doing, it's just coming over here, taking this port and going to 3389 internally. And this also shows that this virtual machine is actually online. And not only that, all the addressing is already in place. So if we go here, this is me. I went to the internet. I went to that public IP address of the DNS cloudapp.net we had, and it was forwarding me to the VM1 for you. This is something you probably do in your company firewall, or you could be doing this in your home with a D-Link or a Links as router. This is where the whole network address translation was taking place, and Azure does that for you. But the main thing to remember from our session point of view here is that everything for the public IP address and the DNS was actually done on the cloud service. And this will be different every time you create a cloud service. So painstakingly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another virtual machine for you here. And what we will do is we'll show that how the cloud service goes and gets the new information. So we'll do a CRanger VM2. I'm going to go and do this. Remember this name here, CRanger2. If we come back over here, obviously CRanger VM2 cloudapp.net, you can see that this was already available for us. But this time, I'll show you something. It actually shows Ranger VM1. This is the previous VM we had, right? Ranger VM1. And this was the name of the cloud service we also had as well. And you can see over here that it is showing us the cloud service name, or it's letting us pick the cloud service name of the previous cloud we had created. This is something we have not talked about. So let's look at this. When you went and created this, or when I went and created this, it actually went and created a cloud service, right? This cloud service, you can see, is actually available here. So if you click on this, you can see there is a cloud service here. We are going to go over cloud services obviously much later, but I want to show you, if you come to the cloud service here, you can actually see that this is the deployment name, Ranger VM1. This was the VIP address or the public address for the cloud service. And these were all the endpoints that were allowed to go to. So it actually goes to Ranger VM1, and these are the endpoints. So this was the port 80, this was the RDP port, and this is the location. So what this means is that you can actually create a cloud service here by itself. So you can create new, and you go to compute. You can see there's a cloud service that you can create, or you can create a cloud service that is already previously created. So when we created the virtual machine, it allowed us to create a cloud service right there to do that, and it was much more streamlined. So obviously, when we are trying to create a new virtual machine, it's asking us if we want to use the same cloud service. So for our purposes, we are not going to create a new, use the current cloud service, and we are going to create a new virtual machine with a new cloud service, and we are going to have a different name. So I guess it's not C Ranger. We're going to call we just call Ranger VM2. I'm going to go here. Looks like somebody already took the Ranger VM2. So like I said, we could name this anything. I'm going to say Ranger VM200. It doesn't matter. I'm going to put it on the same virtual network, same subnet. I'm going to just leave this as is. And I've said create a new cloud. Sorry, I went too fast there. I said create a new cloud service. So it's going to create a new cloud service called Ranger VM200. And we are going to let this one run. So let this one run. And I want to go back to the slide because some of you might have a question right now saying that, hey, you are creating one more VM and you just mentioned that it can be part of the same cloud service. So how does this all work? So that brings me to my next slide. This is what I was talking about, that I'm going to create a second VM and it's going to be part of the same cloud service. I'm not going to create a separate one. So like I mentioned before I started with the cloud service, the definition that I had was that cloud service is a container of virtual machines. The word was virtual machines, not virtual machine. So you can have a single virtual machine one-to-one relationship with a cloud service. So you could have a cloud service here for VM1, you can have a cloud service for VM2, VM3, or as many as you want. Or you can have multiple virtual machines part of the same cloud service. Now, why would you do that? Or why is that even necessary? What would happen is that you'd still have access to these virtual machines through that one single entry point. So for example, I'll have a cloud service called myweb.cloudapp.net, and it will actually point to these both virtual machines. Okay, so now we can see that myweb.cloudapp.net would come to those both virtual machines depending on which endpoints are open on these ones. So obviously it could have separate endpoints open from these virtual machines because the endpoints are open from the virtual machines perspective. Why would we do that though? One of the reasons that we would do that, and we will talk about this when we get into much more cloud service oriented session, is that Azure would actually put a load balancer here. And some of you might have guessed why would they do that? Is that if you come to myweb.cloudapp.net, you could have this part of a load balancer where when you go to myweb.cloudapp.net, it would actually come to VM1 or it will go to VM2, and this load balancing will be transparent to the admin, and Azure would do that for you. So that's one of the reasons why you would have one single cloud service contain multiple virtual machines. This is for a load balancing point of view, and that's a separate configuration and a separate session. But that's why you could have a single cloud service with multiple VMs. Ideally, to access a single virtual machine, so far what we have done in our sessions, we have always created a separate cloud service. And that means that you were given a separate public address every time you created a virtual machine, and it would have a separate whatever cloudapp.net access from here. So let's go back to our client computer here and see what's going on here. I'm hoping that it's provisioning right now, so it might have most of the things provisioned. So if we go to Ranger VM2, and since this was a separate cloud service, you can see that it probably went and picked a different VIP. So it's a 146.149 because you can see it's using a Ranger VM200.cloudapp.net. Means it went and created a separate cloud service. So under cloud services, we can see that it actually picked up it has two entries now, and these are the public URLs or the DNSs from here. So when we see this URL, if we actually had a port 80 and we had the web server running, you could actually go here, click right now, and go to that website. Obviously, I do not have anything, so this is going to wait for it and fail. But since the port 80 endpoint was open, this would be available right now. These DNS entries are live. The other thing I want to show you over here is that on VM1, these were our endpoints. We had 3 endpoints here. On VM2, when we go, we obviously just have 2 endpoints here. Obviously provisioning in progress, but we just have 2 endpoints. So if we had to go and connect to this Ranger VM, and if we click on connect, and you can see it has its own RDP, and I want to save this. Oops. Let's go ahead and click connect, and I'm going to save as to my desktop. I'm going to show you that on the Ranger VM1, it was 53683, and that was the Ranger VM1. With this one, you can see it actually did the cloud app name, the cloud service name over here, Ranger VM200.cloudapp.net, and it picked up a random port. So obviously this DNS is live. So that's what it is. Let's go back to our slide here. That's what we mean by cloud service, and that's how the bigger picture is, that you would go as a user, hit the cloud service, and go get to your virtual machine. So in our previous slide, obviously, we saw this was the story. And when you come to this scenario, obviously it has its own internal IP address. In this scenario, it would have only one single VIP, and it will have 2 DEPs here. But you can have one-to-one relationship like we have in our scenario over here. This too actually has 2 separate cloud apps, the cloud services, and they map in. So that was just to give you an overall picture of how networking is happening when we talk about both public and private. Obviously, in our session here, we're more concerned with this internal network part, or VNet over here, where, as you saw, that when we created the virtual machine, we actually choose the VNet we had created, and it got the IP address from there. But this gives you a bigger picture of how we have been accessing things so far, and I thought that this was the right time to talk about this. We will have a separate session. In this session, there'll be a separate part where we'll be talking more about this VIP and DIP addresses, because so far we have used DHCP, but this DIP addresses can also be static, just like a static internal IP address or private address. We'll talk a little bit more about VIP and cloud services there as well, and how it all fits in. But for now, this is just the big picture of networking. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. As usual, our training site is at cloudranger.net/Azure-training. And we are also on YouTube. Channel is Cloud Ranger Network. We are also on Google Plus and Twitter at Cloud Ranger Blog. And you can always email me at sean@cloudranger.net. Please go ahead and do put in comments and like our videos. It definitely works as an encouragement. I have already replied to some questions that we had, someone had on one of my videos, And it's a good way to have a dialogue or ask questions and receive answers directly if you have a doubt. My whole idea of running these videos is like I try to have as many demos as possible because this is just not only for writing your certification exam. It also gives you an idea to get started right away in your lab environment or even in production after careful planning. So these are the stuff you'd actually do in production. So I try to have as many demos. And what this does is that it gives you the practice. So what I expect is that while you are watching these videos, you pause and have your trial subscription up and running and follow through. And this will actually give you a hands-on training. I'm trying to follow the Microsoft curriculum for this exam as closely as possible. And for this session, if you remember the last part, I went and showed the stuff that was expected out of you for writing the certification exam, which pretty much almost encompasses everything. Anyway, so that concludes our session for today. Thank you for viewing, and I'm going to see you in the future sessions.